Hello, everybody. Ryan again, and we're going to be doing our next installment of our look at the biblical view of homosexuality. And as I mentioned in kind of the intro video last time, we're going to be doing this methodically and carefully, wanting to make sure that we're looking at the text itself of Scripture, which is our only real reliable community-wide standard for understanding these things. Our goal is to, just again to repeat myself, it's to understand the heart and the mind of our King about this issue. And so I'm not wanting this to be a terribly long video, but there is a lot to look at here as we're going to be looking at just the first real, I think, commonly used text to discuss this issue. And that's the text about Sodom and Gomorrah is lumped in with Sodom, but it's specifically Sodom that we see in a text in Genesis chapter 19. But before we go there, many would look to Genesis chapter 1 as a place to start in this conversation. There's an often used, I don't really like it, I don't think it's very helpful to the conversation, but there's an often used line, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. It's rhymey and clever in its own way, I suppose, but the reason that that's not really a helpful line of thinking for this conversation is that while it addresses something about the created order, it's true that God created male and female at the beginning, and he told them to be fruitful and multiply. That is irrefutable. It's right there in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 2 carries you into more detail about how all that happened. The problem with using that in this conversation is that if we're going to use the created order of male and female, we're speaking here of sexuality, romantic love, if you like, and God's intention that it should lead to childbearing. If you're really going to stick to that line of thinking, you run into a few problems, which is number one, not everyone who gets married heterosexually and is sexual together are able to have children. That's true in the biblical record. It's true of a lot of people in the world today. Number two, you also now have to deal with the question, well, is it immoral for a heterosexual couple that gets married in the traditional sense, is sexual in their marriage, are they morally bound to have children? Which different Christians have different ideas of that, but I don't know that we can make an absolutely open and shut case about that biblically. So that's a second thing. A third thing is, what about people who commit to a life of singleness? And I shouldn't even put it that way. People who are single throughout their life or commit to it purposefully, like Jesus, for example. The Apostle Paul indicated singleness was his giftedness as a servant of the Lord. He actually encouraged others to take on that way of life if they were so gifted for the sake of the kingdom. If that's a godly thing in the context of Jesus' words in life, Paul's words in life, and that doesn't match the created order of Genesis 1, where it's not good for man to be alone, be fruitful and multiply physically, you can see the problem. So I don't know that we can carry over the Genesis created order clear picture in Genesis 1 and 2 and really fully develop that in our discussion of homosexuality. And again, we're focusing on committed, monogamous homosexuality. I don't really think we need to wrestle too hard with the question of promiscuity, either heterosexual or homosexual. I think the scriptures are abundantly clear there, and I don't think that's really a debate in many churches, whether God looks on with favor on promiscuity. But so we're talking about committed, monogamous, and if and when permitted, within marriage, homosexuality. So again, Genesis 1 does not seem like a good place to explore that question, given those other complications, even within a heterosexual context. So I'm not going to focus much on that any more than I just did. So what I want to do is go to that next text that is often used in the conversation, and that is, again, in Genesis 19, in which God has sent two of his angelic companions to go check out the city of Sodom, and they're also going to be scoping out Gomorrah. And before we get to 19, you see in chapter 18 that God and his two companion angels have been visiting with Abraham by now, and they've spent time with him to tell Abraham he's going to have a son this time next year. And now he gets up to leave with his two angel companions, and he's about to walk away, and he decides to talk to Abraham, his faithful servant, about what he's up to. And so he tells Abraham, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I'll know." So it's really interesting, side note, but it's interesting that God is doing an exploratory mission. Like, doesn't he know already? It's fascinating to me, the way he puts this. Now remember, Abraham engages God in a conversation about this while the two angels go on to actually go to Sodom physically. And Abraham takes for granted that the city is as wicked as God is suggesting it might be, and so asks, "If you find 50, will you spare him? If you find," and he talks God down to where God actually agrees that if God can find 10, this is in chapter 18, verse 32, if God can find 10 righteous people, he will spare the entire city. Which, as we know, he didn't, so that's a pretty bad indictment on the city, that there weren't even 10 righteous people out of all of them. Now you get to chapter 19, and we have no idea what the sin is that's so grievous and so great. There's no specifics here. God says he's received word, a cry against this city, these two cities, that the sin is great and grievous. Okay, what is that, right? Now, if you know the story, it's gross, it's disturbing, and mature content coming, so I'm assuming based on just our whole conversation, this is people that are okay with some mature sexual discussion. But if you remember, the two angels, who do not look like angels, by the way, they appear as men. They go to the city of Sodom, where they are met by Lot, a righteous man, in the gateway as they come in. And this is totally what righteous people would do in the ancient world and still today. They see strangers coming into town who need to be taken care of, and he offers them help. And he offers to give them a place to stay, to wash their feet, care for them, and then you can move on with your journey tomorrow. This is righteousness in the Old Testament and in the ancient world, and still today. In fact, in the New Testament, the word for hospitality that we use in English, hospitality, in Greek, it's a word that means stranger lover. And it is a virtue, both for the Jew and for the Christian. Loving the stranger who needs to be taken care of as they travel through the land, right? So Lot does that for these two angelic beings, thinking they are humans. He takes them to his house because they weren't willing to go at first, but he really pushes it. He's really insistent, and so they go with him. They say, "Okay, we'll go." So that being the case, they're in the house. He's given them dinner. What it says is before they went to bed. Okay, so it's evening time. The men of the town, young and old, of the town of Sodom, they surround the house where Lot is, and they demand, let me read it for you. This is chapter 19, verse 4. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. So this is a mob. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" Notice they said men. That's going to come up later. "Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." Like, if you're picturing this is disgusting. This is really bizarre. Now, you have to keep in mind, if Lot is showing righteousness by offering help to the strangers, these men of the town are doing the exact opposite by wanting to exploit and abuse strangers. in their town. So Lot is showing righteousness with hospitality. The men are showing wickedness with the worst antithesis to hospitality. Rather than helping, they want to abuse and apparently rape them. So Lot goes out and says, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." And notice what Lot says to them is that they are proposing a wicked thing. Now, here's one of the questions that we have to face. What, in Lot's mind, what part of this is wicked? Is it the fact that they're men wanting to have sex with men? Or is it the fact that they are wanting to take and be violent and abuse his guests? Now, a lot of the traditional teaching on this in the churches is that the real sin here is homosexuality. And that Lot here would clearly be talking about it's a wicked thing that you as men want to have sex with these 2 men. But come on, let's think carefully here. Is that really the issue that Lot is most concerned with? Like, he would be okay with it if his guests were women? And apparently that's not the main thing, because he offers his 2 daughters, not because they're women, so that would be better or okay, but listen to Lot's own words. But don't do anything to these men, not because they're men. He says, don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. This is a hospitality focus. And Lot is horrified that the people of this town would so breach the clear call for hospitality to these strangers that he just can't fathom that they would be doing this. So then, just to carry the point forward, listen to the response of the townsmen. "This fellow came here as a foreigner," notice that, "and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." These are awful people. Okay, this isn't just a matter of their preference sexually. This is a deep, abiding wickedness. It's a sense of cruelty and lack of any amount of compassion, empathy, or selflessness, right? But they mention that Lot's a foreigner. They say, "We'll do worse to you than we're going to do to these strangers coming into our town." The emphasis here is clearly on the treatment of the stranger, the foreigner, which Lot was also. These people are so wicked that they can't tolerate the stranger. They can't help and be loving towards the foreigner, which is a big deal in the scriptural message. Now, does this prove that homosexuality is okay? No, actually, I guess what my point is, as I studied this and I looked all through the Old Testament and New, the treatment of Sodom in the scriptures as a wicked place, as an example of God's judgment against the wicked, doesn't really focus on the sexuality part until the very end of our Bible in the book of Jude. And this is a point that will be made by people who are arguing the case that homosexuality is acceptable to God in the proper context. They'll point out, when people look to Sodom as an example of how bad homosexuality is, and look how God judged homosexuality by destroying the city, I have to agree with them here as I look at this. That's not the issue here. At least not the forefront issue. And I think that's the problem with dealing with this text in the conversation, or bringing it up as an example of how God views this. Because of God's silence about that specific issue in the whole story, what can we do with that, So I guess what I would encourage you to do is, and I'm going to look at a few of these with you, but think carefully on what you do with this text. This is just the beginning of our look, and I'm just doing one text at a time, as I've mentioned before. So I hope you're not drawing any conclusions yet, from the scriptures about the whole topic of homosexuality. But can we at least agree on this? Looking to Genesis 18:19 as any valid argument for or against God's acceptance of homosexuality generally is not a good place to go. It's been pointed out by people who study this on both sides of the issue, if they're looking at it carefully, that as the Old and New Testament passages that reference Sodom and Gomorrah when they bring them up, there really isn't a reference to sexuality at all or homosexuality. It's just wickedness generally most of the time. And it's comparing the people of Israel to Sodom and Gomorrah. It's threatening the same horrible punishment as they received. In fact, Israel is said to be worse than Sodom in a few texts. And you can do a quick search in a concordance to find, excuse me, I gotta plug in one of my devices here, if I can reach it. Should have charged that up before we started. Thank you for your patience. Okay. Sorry about that. So, let me just reference a few of these. In the book of Deuteronomy, and this is interesting because the people of Israel have been in bondage, in slavery in Egypt for 400 plus years, and so they've also wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. So by the time they reach the promised land and they're ready to go in, the older generation, or the younger generation that has grown up, I should say, in the wilderness, Moses says that if they turn aside to follow idols, to worship idols, that their land would be a burning waste of salt and sulfur, nothing planted, nothing sprouting, no vegetation growing on it. It will be like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which Yahweh overthrew in fierce anger. That's Deuteronomy 23:23. Okay, so what that says is that the people knew about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah somehow. So I don't know if Moses told them as God's revealing this history to him. I don't know if they just knew about it as a community-wide memory that they've passed along through the years. But somehow the people knew about Sodom and Gomorrah, and Moses uses it to warn them against idolatry. Now think about it. Did the story that we look at in Genesis 19 have anything to do with idolatry? No indications of idolatry at all. Were they idolatrous? No doubt. Okay? They weren't followers of Yahweh by any indication either. So I think it's safe to assume they're idolatrous, but that wasn't the main issue of the story. So why would Moses bring it up? He didn't talk about homosexuality in reference to the destruction that would come on the people as judgment. He just is saying the way that God judged Sodom and Gomorrah as a wicked people is similar to the destruction he'll bring on you. Again, we're not drawing parallels to homosexuality or specific sins. Just the results of the sin was total destruction. You see that in Deuteronomy 32:32. In talking about how sinful the rebellious nation Israel is, or was, it says, their vine comes from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. That was, Sodom and Gomorrah were just like catchphrases to describe utter wickedness that deserves to be punished. Not references to their homosexuality part of the story, but wickedness in general. On and on it goes. The references are many throughout the prophets. Like I say, do a quick concordance search on your computer or in a book form, and you'll find these. I just wanted to point out that there is one text that does make reference to the sexual part of Sodom's sin. This is in Jude, the 7th verse. There's only one chapter in Jude, so Jude, the 7th verse. And here's what Jude, the half-brother of Jesus, wrote. In a similar way, similar to the angelic beings that left their place, and according to Jude's line of thinking, became sexual out of God's order. In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality. Okay, so they gave themselves over to it. This isn't a few incidents here and there of weakness. This is a way of life. They've just succumbed to it. Here we go. We're full in to sexual immorality. And then in the English, it says sexual immorality and perversion. Now, we have to be careful. In our English text, that word can easily make us think, oh, see, because the men wanted to have sex with the two male guests of Lot, and that's the perversion, that it's homosexual. Possible. Well, what I want to caution you is that's not necessarily what Jude is talking about, because the English word perversion is an English translation of a Greek word, obviously, as it was written in Greek originally. And the very literal meaning of the Greek word in Jude, verse 7, is strange flesh. They went after strange flesh. Okay. Now, again, you might think, well, that fits homosexuality. It's strange flesh in the sense that, if you're thinking of Romans 1, it's unnatural. Okay, because men are naturally to be with women and women to naturally be with men. Possibly. I think that's a valid thought as well. But here's the thing. The strange, that part of the phrase, strange, is based on the word heteros, which I'm sure you can hear that. It's related to heterosexual, because hetero means different. So when it says strange, it means other than you, different than you. It's not you and the same kind as you. It's something other than you and it's different than you. So thus strange. Okay. Not uncommon strange. Strange to you as an individual. It's something not like you. So they were pursuing, going after flesh that was not like theirs. And so there's a couple of thoughts here. One of them I think has no merit, but I'll offer it anyway in case you look into this other places and hear about this. Some have actually suggested, I've seen this in several sources of commentary. Some have suggested one of the reasons that the people of Sodom were being sinful when they insisted that they could have their way with these two angels is because they knew they were angels and wanted to, and get this is commonly said apparently as I'm looking into this, that it's thought that the ancient people, knowing that they were angels, wanted to draw power from these supernatural beings by having sex with them. Like that's a part of the pagan culture, you know. That sounds really bizarre. Doesn't mean it's not true. It sounds very bizarre. But ancient people had weird ideas. So you're like, okay, maybe that's true. My problem with that thought, though, is that nowhere in the text does it indicate anyone knew they were angels. Until maybe they struck those two men struck all the townspeople blind. There's no reason for us to think that Lot and his family or anyone in the town understood that these were supernatural angelic beings. They appeared as men. They're called men in the text. The townspeople say men, meaning humans. So that, if you ever hear that idea, I would encourage you not to take too much or give too much stock to that, because that doesn't make sense with the text. They didn't know they were angels and therefore wanted to draw power from those supernatural beings by having sex with them. There's no indication they even knew they were angels. However, here's the other thought I have. Strange might relate to they were the foreigners. They were the strangers in their town. And remember, the whole Genesis 18:19 context is about primarily about taking care of the weak or the needy, which in that case was a traveler, a stranger. Job was righteous and helped take care of the needy pair. The townspeople were taking advantage of the needy pair. And so I think Jude is very possible. Jude is talking about there was a sexual issue, obviously, because what kind of town is full of men? Full of men, okay? Not just a couple. An entire mob of men in the town, young and old. This was like a lifestyle for them, apparently, of doing this to people. And we're not even sure if they wanted these men because they were men or if they wanted these men because they were the strangers, the vulnerable ones. And even the way they talked a lot, like, hey, who do you think you are? You're the foreigner, and yet you think you can judge us. And they still had this disdain for Lot as a foreigner who came and lived with them. So there's no doubt sexual immorality is a part of their sin. Jude points that out clearly. Fornication. Unacceptable sinful or sexual activity. But whether he's talking about homosexuality isn't really that clear. So if I were to wrap all this up, and this was brief, not as brief as the last video, but I didn't know how to cut this down too much more than I already did. look at the texts yourself. Look at all the references to Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think what you'll find is homosexuality is not a major issue here in that whole reference. So you might be thinking, well, this first look at the scriptures didn't get us very far, and I agree. But that's okay. I mean, that's what we're here to do, is look at each piece as it comes and see, does this help us understand God's heart and mind about this issue of homosexuality? And some of the time we're going to find out, no, this didn't bring much clarity. And I think there will be obviously times when, yes, this has really helped. But see, if I were to skip over the ones that I decide aren't helpful or that relevant, like this one, I would have been happy to skip the Sodom thing because I personally don't think that this has much to say about the homosexuality question from God's point of view. That might still leave you with that question. Well, why didn't he cover that? That seems like it's relevant. So I just wanted to cover this, and we'll be covering other texts maybe that I might personally decide they're not relevant to our thought about this. But since you might think it is, and you might look at it yourself as relevant, I just wanted to share with you what I understand about those things. So if you have any questions about this, if you have anything you think I glossed over it or I didn't look carefully enough at a certain part of this, please let me know. The comments, of course, I'm going to pay attention to those. However you'd like to do it. Questions, comments, disagreements, I'm open to all of it because we're just trying to learn from the word of our King together. So, first text, Genesis 19, the issue of Sodom, not a huge help for us, but at least we've looked at it, and hopefully you can see there is good reason to think this is not a good place to go in trying to discuss, debate, or think through this issue. All right, so that's it for now. We'll get to the next text with our next edition. Can't tell you when that'll be, but it shouldn't be long because I do want to keep our momentum going here of learning about this together. I believe our next text will be in Leviticus with a really clear reference to sexuality between the same genders and God's law to Israel. And that'll be, I think, a really key text to look at, and certainly won't be like this one where maybe there's not much to learn. So I hope that you can join me for that. And until then, God bless you. I love you. And we'll keep seeking the Lord's will together. Bye-bye.